A man in Nova Scotia once took a simple DNA test, expecting the same result every generation of his family had claimed: Scottish through and through. But the genome didn't agree. When a local geneticist reviewed his results, buried inside his DNA were rare French lineages and even older Indigenous maternal markers that were only supposed to exist in a population Britain claimed to have erased in 1755. Then a second case appeared, this time from rural Appalachia. A woman with an English surname, no known French ancestry, and no connection to Canada at all, carried the exact same genetic signature. And then more cases surfaced, dozens, hundreds, different families, different regions, the same impossible DNA. Every time researchers traced the lineage backward, it pointed to the same origin, a people who were never supposed to survive. A culture official records insisted had been shattered beyond repair, a community the British scattered so widely that history was never meant to put the pieces back together again. But the pieces did come back. Because the one thing the British couldn't destroy was the story written in Acadian blood. If mysteries like this fascinate you, hit like. It helps more people discover Stone and Bone and keeps these forgotten histories alive. On a September morning in 1755 in the quiet village of Grand-Pré, hundreds of Acadian men stood packed inside their church, surrounded by British soldiers. They didn't know why they'd been summoned. They didn't know their families were already blocked from reaching them. They didn't know their world was about to be dismantled. Colonel John Winslow unrolled his orders and read them aloud. Their lands were seized, their homes taken, their freedom revoked. They would be removed from Nova Scotia, permanently. Outside, wives and mothers waited in confusion, holding children who sensed something terrible unfolding. Moments later, soldiers began dragging men from the church straight onto waiting ships, leaving families screaming on the shoreline as the vessels pulled away. And that day was only the beginning. Ships were overloaded on purpose. Food and water were scarce. Disease spread through the dark holds. Entire families vanished at sea. On the Duke William, all 364 passengers drowned when the ship sank in the North Atlantic. It was one of the first large-scale engineered removals in North American history. Deliberate, systematic, and intended to erase a people. But the British misunderstood the Acadians. They saw a small farming community. They saw neutrality. They saw vulnerability. What they didn't see was how deeply rooted the Acadians already were in the land, not just culturally, but genetically. Long before the deportation, the Acadians had become something Europe never expected, a distinct people shaped by isolation, indigenous alliance, and a way of life unlike anything in the colonial world. The real story of Acadian survival doesn't begin with ships leaving Grand-Pré. It begins 150 years earlier, when a tiny group of settlers arrived in North America and created a society that defied every rule of empire. And that's where our story turns next. The Acadian story begins in 1604, when fewer than 100 French settlers crossed the Atlantic looking for something France never gave them: a chance to live on their own terms. These weren't soldiers or nobles. They were farmers, carpenters, and fishermen, people tired of living at the bottom of a system stacked against them. When they reached the Bay of Fundy, they didn't behave like a European colony. They didn't seize land. They didn't drive the Mi'kmaq away. They didn't rebuild France. They built something new. They traded with the Mi'kmaq. They learned from them. Some married into their communities long before priests arrived to complain about mixing blood. And that knowledge, how to survive winter, how to move with the tides, how to hunt, forage, and store food, kept the settlers alive in a place far harsher than anything back home. Even their politics were different. Instead of hierarchy, they used small community councils. Instead of waiting for orders from France, they acted independently. The crown hated it. Rome hated it. But the Acadians didn't care. They weren't rebelling. They were choosing a way of life that worked. Within a few generations, they weren't acting French anymore. They were becoming something else. And by the time Europe noticed, the transformation was already in their blood. For the next 100 years, war turned Acadia into a tug-of-war between France and Britain. Borders shifted constantly, immigration slowed to almost nothing, and the small group of settlers who remained began marrying within the same circle of families. Isolation locked the population in place. Roughly 76 families became the foundation of the entire Acadian community. Over the next 150 years, through repeated intermarriage in tiny, isolated villages, those 76 families narrowed even further. By the modern era, Acadian descendants could trace most of their ancestry to just 37 core founding lines. We know this because of science, not folklore. In 2018, Dr. Marie-Claire Arsenault analyzed more than 3,000 Acadian DNA samples. Her findings were striking. Rare European maternal lineages like H121 and H3G nearly vanished in France were common among Acadians. On the paternal side, the Y chromosome marker R1b, U1006, connected directly to one 17th century settler, Antoine Bourgeois, one man whose descendants now number in the thousands. This is what a founder effect looks like in real life. A small population, little new blood, and traits magnified over centuries. The result was a community genetically distinct from France and increasingly distinct from its indigenous neighbors. A demographic island growing in the shadow of two empires. But another influence shaped the Acadians. One the church tried to hide, one the written records erased, but the DNA didn't forget. And that secret sits at the heart of Acadian identity. Open and Burse, early Acadian baptism book, and it looks simple. French names, French families, French mothers, but the registers don't tell the truth. When French men married Mi'kmaq or Maliseet women, which happened often in the early decades, priests baptized the women under French names and listed them as French. Their original identities disappeared in a single entry. The paperwork hid the truth. The DNA brings it back. Modern Acadian maternal lines contain two unmistakable indigenous markers. A2, about 4% of Acadians today, X2A. About 2% neither exists in Europe. Both are Native American in origin. And because mitochondrial DNA passes from mothers to children, these markers prove exactly what the priests tried to mask. Indigenous women were central to Acadian survival. They taught the settlers how to withstand winters that killed Europeans who arrived unprepared. They taught them which plants healed, preserved food, built homes, and mapped the tides. They were cultural anchors, and their children inherited both their knowledge and their DNA. By the mid-1700s, Acadians were no longer simply French colonists. They were a hybrid population, French fathers, indigenous mothers, and a century and a half of genetic drift making them unlike any group in North America. And that uniqueness, cultural and genetic, was about to collide with the ambitions of the British Empire. Because a people who don't fit into an empire's categories are the first people an empire tries to remove. By the mid-1700s, the Acadians weren't just another colonial community. They had become a political problem the British couldn't ignore. They controlled the richest farmland in the region, the marshlands around the Bay of Fundy. But these fields weren't natural. Acadians created them through a system of dikes and a boiteau engineered with Mi'kmaq title knowledge. Those reclaimed lands produced enough food to support Halifax and multiple British garrisons. Yet the Acadians didn't depend on the British at all. They didn't trade exclusively with them, they didn't fight for them, they wouldn't swear an unconditional oath to them. The British saw neutrality as defiance, and worse, they saw Acadian independence as a threat. Governor Charles Lawrence made it clear in his letters. As long as the Acadians remained in Nova Scotia, the province would never be fully British. They were too independent, too self-sufficient, too connected to indigenous communities Britain wanted to control. And beneath the political language was something else: fear. A hybrid population rooted in land Britain wanted. A people with their own identity, their own alliances, their own way of living. A society the Empire couldn't categorize or command. To British officials, this wasn't a group to negotiate with. It was a population to remove. The decision was made quietly, long before the first ships arrived. And when the moment finally came, the destruction was faster and more brutal than anything the Acadians imagined. September 1755. Grand-Pré. A quiet Acadian village turned into a trap. British soldiers marched hundreds of Acadian men and boys into the church, locked the doors, and delivered the order that shattered their world. Their lands were seized, their homes taken, their families would be removed from Nova Scotia forever. Outside, women and children waited, unaware the soldiers had already decided their fate. The deportation began instantly. Men were marched straight from the church onto overcrowded ships. Women screamed and fought through the lines. Children clung to their parents until bayonets forced them apart. None of this was accidental. It was designed. Ships were overloaded, rations were cut to the bone, disease swept through the holds. Bodies were thrown overboard daily. On the Violet, 280 Acadians boarded. Only 120 survived. On the Duke William, 364 drowned when the ship sank in the North Atlantic. Entire family lines erased in minutes. And then there was the Bell family. Pierre Bell was shipped to South Carolina. His wife Marie was sent to Pennsylvania. Their 6 children were divided among 3 different colonies. Pierre died never knowing where his family went. Marie searched for 17 years and never found a single one. Only 2 Bell children ever reunited decades later in Louisiana. It is one of the most heartbreaking stories in Acadian history. And here's something I want to ask you. Which part of this tragedy hits you the hardest? The separation, the deaths, or the deliberate nature of the plan? Tell me in the comments. Different people feel different pieces of this moment, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Because behind every number in this history is a family like the Bells, torn apart by design. The British claimed they deported about 13,000 Acadians, but the numbers never matched reality. Church register and land records show a population closer to 18,000 to 20,000 before the deportation. But thousands don't appear on ship lists, death logs, or settlement records. So where did they go? Modern genetics helps answer that question. When researchers analyzed Acadian founder lines, the same H1C1, H3G, and R1B U106 signatures tied to 37 core families, the population models pointed to a massive demographic collapse. The genetic bottleneck was too tight to align with official British numbers. The data suggests that 8,000 to 10,000 Acadians likely died during the deportation or soon after. Starvation on ships, disease in overcrowded holds, drowning during transit, exposure in colonies that refused to accept them. The British didn't record these deaths because recording them meant acknowledging the scale of what they had done. Yet even this isn't the full story. Thousands of Acadians weren't captured at all. They fled into Mi'kmaq territory, hid in remote forests, or slipped into New Brunswick and Cape Breton under new names. Some blended into Scottish, Irish, or Indigenous communities. Others disappeared into the interior. These families vanished from the written record, but not from the genetic one. Their descendants still carry the signatures of the founders, the same rare French lineages, the same indigenous maternal traces, the same Acadian patterns that should have disappeared forever. The Empire tried to erase them. The DNA says it didn't succeed. The British believed their plan was complete. Round up the Acadians, load the ships, scatter the families, watch the culture die. But thousands slipped through their grasp. Entire families escaped into Mi'kmaq and Maliseet territory. Forests, rivers, and coastal routes the British never controlled. These refugees became the Acadians' cachets, the hidden Acadians. To survive, they erased themselves. They changed their surnames. They stopped speaking French in public. They blended into Scottish, Irish, and Indigenous communities. Children grew up with new identities, never knowing their families had once been Acadian. But genetics has a longer memory than any written record. Modern DNA testing uncovered Acadian signatures in places historians never expected. 15% of Newfoundland's population carries Acadian markers. Families in Cape Breton with names like White, Smith, and LeBlanc share Y chromosomes tied to early Acadian founders such as Antoine Bourgeois. Appalachian families once labeled mysterious origin now match Acadian haplotypes almost perfectly. On paper, these communities had no link to Acadia. In their DNA, the link is undeniable. If discoveries like this make you see history differently, if you enjoy uncovering hidden stories that were never meant to survive, consider subscribing to Stone and Bone. There are so many more mysteries just like this waiting to be explored. Because the Acadians, the British thought they erased, were rebuilding themselves in the shadows. When Acadians reached Louisiana in the 1760s, they arrived shattered. Families broken, homes stolen, culture hanging by threads. And Louisiana offered them nothing easy. They were given swampland no one wanted, land too dangerous, too humid, too unforgiving for newcomers. But the Acadians had survived worse. They adapted again. They learned fishing, trapping, and swamp survival from indigenous groups like the Chitimacha. They blended their cuisine and traditions with Africans already living in the region. They absorbed Spanish building styles and tools. Out of trauma and necessity, a new culture formed, Cajun. But the rebirth carried a genetic price. Louisiana Acadians went through a second bottleneck, losing around 35% of the genetic diversity preserved in maritime Acadia. Founder mutations intensified. Conditions like retinitis pigmentosa became far more common in isolated Acadian-descended communities, including Cheticamp, where it affects 1 in 27 people. Culture survived, language survived, but the genome recorded every hardship. And that genome would eventually expose truths the church and the crown hid for centuries. Acadian DNA is now one of the clearest genetic timelines in North America. A living record of survival, loss, and resilience mapped across 4 centuries. Because the population began small, stayed isolated, and endured multiple bottlenecks, their signatures are unusually easy to track. Rare European. Maternal lineages like H1C1 and H3G amplified through isolation. Paternal lineages like R1B U1O6 tracing directly to settlers such as Antoine Bourgeois. Indigenous maternal markers like A2 at 4% and X2A at 2%. Marriages the church simply wrote down as French. Elevated recessive traits caused by founder effects. A genetic footprint running from Nova Scotia to Louisiana to the Appalachian Mountains. Because of these patterns, Acadian DNA is used today to reconstruct early settlement, solve continental genealogy puzzles, identify hidden Acadian descendants, and understand how populations survive deportation, famine, shipwrecks, and forced displacement. The British could erase names from parish books. They could sink ships. They could scatter families. But they could not stop chromosomes from preserving the truth. And now that truth is rising into the present, in ways governments never expected. Today, the Acadian story isn't just history, it's a political question, and a sensitive one. Are Acadians simply French Canadians? Or are they a distinct people shaped by more than a century of isolation, unique founder effects, indigenous maternal ancestry, an attempted ethnic cleansing, and a diaspora spread across two nations? The evidence is overwhelming. Acadians aren't generic descendants of France. They are a population forged in North America, a people whose identity and genome evolved far from Europe. But recognition comes with consequences. If Acadians are acknowledged as distinct, especially with measurable indigenous ancestry, it opens the door to land claims, cultural rights, political autonomy, and potential reparations. And governments rarely welcome conversations that require revisiting historical wrongs. Some argue Acadians should merge quietly into broader French-Canadian identity. Others argue that blending in is exactly what the deportation was designed to achieve. DNA complicates that argument. It shows a people who never disappeared. The Acadian fight today is not about nostalgia. It's about standing visible after a century of being told their people were gone. The British believed deporting the Acadians would erase them. They believed scattering families would dissolve their identity. They believed starvation, shipwrecks, and silence would finish the job. But the Acadians didn't vanish. They reappeared in the Louisiana bayous. They resurfaced in forgotten fishing villages in Newfoundland. They hid in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and the Appalachian Mountains. They carried on through 37 founding lineages, through indigenous mothers hidden in the records, through genetic markers that should have disappeared centuries ago but didn't. A nation erased on paper survived in blood. A story buried by empire resurfaced through science. And a people who were never meant to endure still echo across an entire continent. If this story revealed something new about history, consider liking the video and subscribing to Stone and Bone. It helps bring more buried stories back into the light. And tell me in the comments if anything in your own family history ever surprised you. You never know what stories your DNA is hiding.